Hi, this week we are going to talk about principles of assessment, particularly in relation to how assessment connects with learning and teaching, and how it can be a very valuable tool in not only promoting and encouraging learning, but also as a tool for reflecting on how well we're teaching. So first I want to just briefly talk about the power of assessment. I think in our lives, we've always had assessments for various things. And in many ways, they act as gatekeepers, which really means that, for example, if some of you may have taken the IELTS or the TOEFL IBT, which is the English language test, that is there's a required score that allows you entry into a university or an academic program overseas. And really, these passing scores or these benchmark scores are gatekeepers. So those who are able to get that are able to continue on, and those who do not get that score are not allowed in. So it really decides who is able to go to university in an English-speaking country and who's not. There's something similar that we have here in Australia called the ATAR, which is the Australian Tertiary Admissions Rank. And that's a score that, based on their examinations at the end of the year, after year 12, they're given a rank. And this rank basically decides if they get to go to their chosen area of study. So again, the exams that they take are gatekeepers. They decide who is let in and who's not. A more positive one that I'm quite happy that we have is a driving test. So, if you want to drive here in Australia, you have to take a driving test, and one that's a very practical driving test to decide who's allowed on the roads and who's not. There's also oftentimes in foreign service, if you're going to be a diplomat, you have to take a particular test. This is definitely true in the States, to decide who is let in and who's not. So tests are used as gatekeepers. They decide who's let in and who is excluded. The other powerful thing about assessment is they often have an affective nature to them. So they actually produce emotions like anxiety and fear. So sometimes when you think of assessment task, you can feel your stomach drop, or you start feeling anxious. So that something like that can create such an emotional reaction so easily shows that it is very powerful. The other thing is that it is a conduit of change. So assessment can create change. For example, if in a classroom I found that students weren't attending, and I said, well, actually, we're going to have an assessment that is 100% your grade, but it's going to be in class today, I'm sure that there would be 100% attendance, because they would come to class if they knew that it was based, if their end of semester score was based on attendance. Recently we have a new literacy and numeracy test called the Landheit that those who are studying in teacher education must do. So it's the idea that if they can ensure that students, that pre-service teachers or students that are preparing to be teachers, if they take this test, then maybe, and we make sure that everyone has basic literacy and numeracy skills, maybe we can ensure that there's teacher quality in our schools. So if we're having problems with quality in our schools, maybe this test can help decide who should be allowed to continue on with the teacher education program. There's a lot of studies. There's actually a book by Shahami, and it talks about the power of language assessments specifically. And the other thing about assessment tasks and tests is that they have consequences. So it can change your life direction and goals. If you, for example, took the IELTS, a language test, and it wasn't enough to get into a course, it really does change your life direction and goals. So you don't get into the course you want, you don't get to have the experience that you want. But one of the things that I found in some of my research on the TOEFL IBT is that often these powerful tests are used for purposes that they were never intended for. For example, in Vietnam, I found that many students were taking the TOEFL IBT but never planned to take the TOEFL IBT. And that was primarily because it was basically promoted as you don't have to take the test, but if you can learn about the test, then you basically have a very strong academic language background, because you have the skills that they test in this particular test. So in many ways, it was a way that private organizations, after students had finished the top level, they would encourage them to take the TOEFL IBT skills course, even though they weren't planning to go overseas or they didn't need it. But it was kind of, if you were advanced enough, they would encourage you to do the TOEFL IBT class. So very interesting that the TOEFL IBT was meant to assess academic language that is needed to go study in an English-speaking country. It was never intended to just teach skills about academic language. As educators, we assess all the time, both formally and informally, and I think it's really important that assessments we often think as one thing and it's very formal, but assessment should be both formal and informal, and it should be all the time. We should have so much information and data about our students, because this should be really informing what we teach and areas for improvement in students' own learning. So as educators, we need to make sure that we're literate in assessment so that we understand testing principles, and we'll talk more about that later. We also need to understand how testing can impact our students, so that we know that the assessment task that we give has an impact on our students. We talk about that affective nature. It makes them nervous. It can have a positive, however, impact as well. So if we have a test that is really meaningful and students are able to prepare for that, then they're learning meaningful skills. So it can be a very positive thing as well. But it's important for us as educators to create assessments that actually encourage students to learn meaningful and appropriate information, so that they can continue to develop in their language proficiency. As I mentioned before, assessment is really connected to teaching and learning, because as we assess, we use assessments to assess student knowledge, both before, during, and after teaching. So we're always assessing student knowledge. But through assessments, we're assessing our own teaching. So for example, if we give an assessment task and all the students do really poorly on it, that then helps us understand, well, maybe we didn't teach these concepts well enough. And so it should help us reflect on our own teaching. Assessment is the idea of we gather evidence of student learning. And evidence is directly observable. We have to actually see it or hear it. So these are the things that students can do. We can gather information on what students can do, what they can say, what they can write, what they create. Those are really the main things that we can assess: what they do, what they say, what they write, or what they create. Even things like listening, we actually can only assess listening based on them doing something, whether they're comprehension questions or following a set of instructions. That's how we assess their listening. So it's what students can do, say, write, or create. That's what we assess, and that's what we gather evidence on. Patrick Griffin, who has talked a lot about assessment, particularly here in Australia, talks about that evidence, that it is this evidence that drives observation and teaching in the classroom. So really, evidence of students' abilities to use the language and so on should help us identify the changes that need to happen, both in students' learning and our teaching. The other thing is that assessment requires a focus on development and skills, not just scores. I think that's the thing, is we often think about assessment as just a score, but assessment should really focus on developing the students' development and skills in the language, and evidence, that we should have evidence to back it up, not just saying, well, I think that the student's ability is like this, that we actually have real evidence to say this is where the students are. So here's some of the purposes of assessment. We have diagnostic assessment, and diagnostic assessment is usually done before a unit or so on. It can be done at different times, particularly if there's a student that's really struggling. But really, diagnostic assessment is about gathering information about students' readiness to learn. So what concepts and skills do they have already, so that you can build upon those or reteach those concepts or skills if they do not have them already. It also helps teachers group students and identify students that may have additional needs. The other thing is that, as I mentioned before, it assesses students' current knowledge and understanding. And diagnostic assessment doesn't have to be a formal one. You can do this by having a class discussion and asking questions and finding out, okay, well, I don't think students really understand this. Using questioning, really high quality questioning. And then you can use more formal means, which would be like a pre-test to find out what students know. But you can find a little bit about what students understand and know through inquiry approaches. Saying, for example, if you had a particular, you were talking about past continuous, and you got students to give examples of what that means and examples of structures and forms of that to find out what they know already and what needs to be taught. And usually diagnostic assessment is not something that's graded. There are a lot of terms that we use, but one of the things that we'll talk about is assessment for learning. And if you think about the for, you can connect it with formative assessment. Formative is to shape. The point of assessment is to shape students' understanding. This is often during the topic or unit, and it can be both formal and informal. But the important thing for formative assessment, and this is really, really important, is that there's a focus on the process of learning. It's not about the end, reflection of their achievement. It's about the process of learning. And an important part of this is giving feedback throughout the process. So for teachers, students' progress helps you to inform your own teaching. But for students, feedback helps them progress in their learning. So it's important to be providing feedback. Now, one of the things that can be really problematic is if you have students in very large classrooms. How do you give feedback? Well, there's a variety of different ways. You can use peer feedback and so on, or class discussions. But examples of formative assessment or assessment for learning can even just be things for quality questioning and asking questions and getting them to think even further on those questions. Having mock or tests that are not important tests, but just mock tests to get them prepared for a very summative or assessment that's at the end. Using anecdotal notes, taking notes on how students are doing. For example, with speaking, noticing how often students interact, how often they initiate conversation. And then more formal things like written comments on work. But you can also, have these little conversations as you monitor students' learning throughout the lesson. Now there's assessment as learning. And as learning means that the students are part of it. So they have self-assessment, so reflection. They reflect on their own progress. Now checklists are really helpful. So, using I can statements. I can do this, I can do this. If you're using a scoring guide or a rubric, allowing students to use that to self-assess their own written drafts. Also assessing current knowledge and making goals and identifying strategies. So saying, I'm really struggling with past tense. My goal is to do this, once a week. Maybe it's some worksheets, maybe it's some exercises, maybe it's writing in the past tense, creating a story in the past tense. But also identifying strategies to help them. One of the things that is helpful with young children, and this is more in kind of an Australian classroom where you might have a mainstream classroom with some students with limited language, is emotion cards where every student would have some cards that, maybe there's a smiley face, maybe there's a frustrated face, a sad face, a card with a question mark. And everyone has one on their desk, and if they're doing independent work, they can flip up the card. Like if they're happy, then but if they flip up the card, they're frustrated or something like that, that you can go work with them. They need some additional help. And that's for students to not feel like they have to get out of their seat and ask the teacher if they're a bit shy. Then you can see from from wherever you are in the room, what students need some extra scaffolding and which students are on task and doing well. Peer assessment. Now peer assessment is something that really students have to be trained in peer assessment and understand the reason why we do peer assessment, because some students don't like it because they want teacher feedback, not student feedback. But I think it's how you design these tasks. So you can give general feedback or comments, but also it's really even better ways to use things like checklists. if they're writing, if this is a more advanced class and they're writing topic sentences, have they used a topic sentence for each paragraph? You would just check yes or no. Using things like rubrics for, and when I say rubrics, those are the things that we use in our classes that have, for example, HD, so you have the different levels, but then you have the different criteria. So maybe one criteria is to do with content, one is about structure, one is about language structure. And you have a description for each criteria and each level, which would be HD, D, C, and so on. Also, peer assessment can ensure that students participate in group work. So if they have to peer assess each other, then they sometimes are a bit more willing to work in groups. So one of the things that you might think about are what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of self or peer assessment in your own context. Now, then there's assessment of learning. And this is kind of, the end of the unit, end of the lesson. We're trying to see, did they actually learn the things that they were supposed to learn? We often call it summative assessment. It's the end of the topic or unit assessment. And the focus, instead of the process, the focus is on the product of teaching and learning. Did they actually produce what they needed to produce and what was taught at the end? Usually, summative assessment or assessment of learning is more formal, and it's what we often think about of assessment, the paper and pen assessments, and usually comes with a score. One other note I want to say is that summative assessment, even though it's, we say it's traditional, but it has its place, but you need to be making sure that you have a variety of different ways to assess, both formatively and summatively. Now, here are some of the principles of assessment, and we'll talk more about this in the tutorials, but one of the principles is validity. Now, if you were going to think of any particular word that comes to mind, I think of truth. Does the assessment task accurately measure what it intends to measure? Is it a true measurement of what it intends to measure? So I'll give you an example. Let's say you want to assess a student's pronunciation. So you have them read a book. Is this a valid measure of their ability? Well, the problem with that is that, let's say the student's pronunciation is quite good, but they struggle with reading. In this one, are you actually assessing their reading ability or their pronunciation? So you're asking them to read a book aloud, but if they're tripping up on vocabulary, then it's not really an assessment of their pronunciation. It's an assessment of their vocabulary understanding. So it's understanding that that would not, if you're making them read aloud a book, it may not be a valid measure of pronunciation because there's other things you're measuring as well. The other example would be if you have a task and, for example, maybe you want them to role play something, but you have a lot of instructions and directions, but they can't understand the instructions. So they misunderstand the task. While they may have been able to do the task really well, they could discuss and they could speak very, very well and role play this activity very, very well. Because they didn't understand the instructions and their reading wasn't very strong, then they had a poor or a low score on their role play. So it's understanding that you need to make sure that it's accurately measuring what it intends to measure. If it's trying to measure a role play scenario, then you need to make sure that they do understand what they need to do beforehand, and that their lack of reading or reading ability doesn't interfere with being able to assess how well they actually do the role play. There's different kinds of validity. One is content validity, and that's that a test or an assessment samples the subject matter. So if you were going to do a test of tennis, let's say, but you had students show how well they were at tennis by running a 100-meter dash, it doesn't really show. It's not the content. For tennis, you'd be thinking it's about swinging, it's about accuracy of hitting the ball, so on, not about running. So it's not really the content validity. It lacks content validity because it's not actually sampling the important skills of tennis. If you just had a multiple choice for a driving test and there was no practical, does that there's a lot of things that skills we need to have for driving. Can a multiple choice test cover all of those? Well, maybe it'll cover the content as far as, the rules, but it doesn't actually sample the important skills that you need for the practical. The other type of validity is what we call criterion related, which means a test that measures, having another test that measures similar to another equal criterion. So let's say you have a grammar test and a student does really well on it, but then they have those same kind of grammatical things that have been tested on, then they are writing and they miss all of these grammatical structures. So you think, well, why can they demonstrate their ability to do well in the grammar test, but not in writing? So then there's some criterion related validity saying that if they should be able to, if it's the same skill, they should be doing similarly in the same one. Now, of course, there's other things that we'll talk about later that may be happening with the student, like maybe they were sick one day. But in general, you should have measures that you can see consistently that they're doing the same. Because if they're not consistently doing the same, if you're being tested on the same thing in different tests or assessments, and they're not doing well, then it causes issues of whether the test itself is not valid. So maybe the grammar test was really easy. And so even though they didn't know the grammatical structures, they were able to guess. So that's the kind of thing of making sure that it does accurately measure students' ability. The last one is construct, and that's a little bit harder to understand, but construct validity is that a test reflects the theoretical meaning of a concept. So for example, if you do a reading test, if we think about theoretically what are the skills needed for reading, does it actually test that? Does it have construct validity? Reliability, and the word that I think of when I think of reliability is consistency. So for validity, it's truth. How truthful are the results of that test? Does it really measure what the students understand? Reliability is about more consistency. So if you can give this test at different times, would they have the same result? So the things that might cause problems with this is student reliability. So maybe the student's sick or anxious. So that's why there's not reliability. The other is rater reliability. We know that scoring processes can be subjective. So one of the things is interrelated reliability. So two more scores have different scores. So for example, let's say myself, Jessica, and Lynn, who are teaching this unit, we mark the same assessment task, and we all have very, very different scores. Then there's an issue with how well the scoring process is. And just as a side note, we do get together and we moderate the assessment task to make sure that we are assessing similarly. So we need to make sure there's inter-rater reliability. Are the scores rating in similar ways? The other thing is intra-rater reliability. This is where, maybe I have students that are my favorite, and so I tend to give them higher scores. Or I try to mark 25 papers in one day. So when I'm, at the beginning, I'm, quite consistent, and then by the end, I'm getting tired, so I'm getting much more harsh on my comments or my scores, and so on. So these sorts of things, and we as assessors often think of, for me, I think about what is a reasonable amount of papers I can do in one day so that I'm on track for each one. For favorites, oftentimes I will download them and I won't put the names on, so I don't see whose work it is. And the other thing is we also moderate, so we can make sure that we're not favoring certain students, that it's very, very reliable. And also we go back, oftentimes I'll go back and particularly the ones that I first marked, I'll go back and mark those again to make sure that I've been consistent over time. The other kind of reliability that we talk about is test administration reliability. So things like noise, lighting, and poor photocopying. So if students are taking an assessment task and there's a lot of noise, that could affect how well they do. Poor photocopying is a big thing. If you can't read it, then they might have done really well on the test, but they couldn't read the photocopy very well, and so then it's an inconsistent test. Then there's test reliability, so the nature of the test. What if your questions aren't clear? And so the students answer, they actually do know the answer to it, but because the question wasn't very clear, they actually put the wrong answer. Another thing about time limits, some students really struggle with time limits. How well do they actually do if there's no time limit? Now, the important thing is that if a test is reliable, but not valid, a test has to be valid. So a test could be not valid but reliable, but still it's not a very good test. Obviously you want it to be both reliable and valid. But if a test is unreliable, then it also can't be valid, because that, as we talked about, if a student doesn't understand the question, even though they actually do know the answer, the question isn't clear, so they get a wrong answer. So then the test doesn't accurately measure what it intends to measure. So that's where reliability and validity often will affect and influence one another. The other principle is authenticity. So how well does the task represent real-world tasks? Is the language natural? Is it just an isolated thing, or is it contextualized? Can you see a context to it? And is it meaningful and relevant? Now, it's important to understand that you can't always have a really authentic test or assessment task, but you can include aspects of it. So you can measure how authentic something is. So sometimes one assessment will be very authentic and then another won't be so much, but it is a principle to consider. How authentic, how closely to real world tasks is it? The other one is practicality. And this is an important thing. You need to make sure that an assessment task isn't too expensive. It doesn't take too much time. It's easy to administer. And it has a scoring and evaluation procedure that is clear and time efficient. So this is really important because, and there will be some tests, like multiple choice tests, actually, they do take a long time to create because creating multiple choice questions can be difficult, but it's easy to administer. It doesn't take too much time and it's not expensive. And usually the scoring is really easy because you're just A, B, C, or D. But kind of like authenticity, you can't always just focus on practical tests, because then the more practical a test is, usually the less authentic it is. An example of, if you are going to interview all your students, maybe if you have a class of 20, that's okay, but if you have a class of 55, it's not very practical to interview all of your students, all 55 of your students. So you have to think about the nature of the practicality of the assessment task. So these are just a few things to think about in regards to assessment, its relationship to learning and teaching, and these assessment principles such as validity, reliability, authenticity, and practicality. We'll also talk about fairness and just generally how fair is a test. What is the face validity of it in regards to, do students think it's a fair test and actually measures what it intends to measure? Thanks for listening. Bye.